Whitney, again, we all know each other. Whitney and I have spoke before, and I was just fascinated when she was telling me about her philosophy behind uh, basically training for athletic performance, and it's really interesting. So if you just want to talk about that for a little bit, and then we'll just ask questions from there based on that.
Yeah, of course. So, like I said, my name is Whitney, and I am an athletic therapist. Whenever I am working with people, my main goal is not just to give them exercise, but it's also to make sure that they are educated while I'm giving them exercises. Because down the road, I want people to be able to make the right decisions for themselves. So going into a training session, there's always an assessment. It's me figuring out where exactly you are right now, what are goals you want to get to, and what are different movements that you've been doing in your life that might be impeding you without you realizing that. And during our session, it's about making sure that you understand why we're doing an exercise, how that's going to help you in your daily life, um, and what are things that you can do on your own to make sure that you're not in pain or that your mobility is getting better. Because I find a lot of people are unaware of how their body moves and what their body needs to be doing for them to be pain free. And they're going to be like, yeah, like my knees hurt. And then there's this one movement that they're doing all the time that's causing your knee pain. While if you are educated on how the knee works, you're going to be smart enough to be like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this, or I should take a rest from this, or, so my biggest thing is just educating people.
So from that,
That's
oh,
I actually noticed that when. Go ahead, Vise. Go
oh, I
ahead.
was just gonna say, like from that educational approach, you're looking to teach people
Mm-hmm.
basically how to move and what feels good versus what doesn't feel good, and instruct them in ways that are going to develop better habits. How does that build into athletic performance?
So with athletic performance, the biggest thing is that you need mobility and you need strength. And whenever you're working with someone, or whenever I'm working with someone or any like strength and conditioning coach, the important thing is making sure that if I'm going to load a joint, I need to know what it feels like when that joint is being loaded properly. Because if the joint is being loaded properly, that's when injuries happen, whether it's overuse or ligaments or tendons are being injured. So whenever let's say I'm having someone do a squat, I'm going to be like, okay, let's do a squat. And at the bottom of your squat, what does that feel like? They should be able to tell. Because if you're transferring that over to, let's say, a basketball player in the court, when you're down in your defensive stance, you should be able to be down in the squat and be like, all right, this feels right, this doesn't feel right. Because most times, whenever athletes get injured, their body always gave them an indication of something's wrong. And they're like, oh, I'm fine, I'm just going to push through it. And that's when the injury happens.
Mm.
So if you are training for athletic performance, you should be able to tell what your body is doing when it's right and when it's not right. So when you're on the court and something feels off, you're like, okay, maybe I need to stretch this during my next break, or maybe I need to talk to someone, before the next game or something like that.
And when it comes down to, because you're talking about squatting here, what's your
Hmm.
philosophy on the knee positioning of when it comes down to squatting? Like how like what is a proper what should a proper squat look like?
So there's a lot of discussion going on around whether it's like knees over the toes or not knees over the toes, whether it's back squat or front squat. And what I always tell people, once the way you squat is going to be personalized to you. The way I'm going to have someone that's 6'4" squat is going to be completely different than the way I'm going to have like someone that's 5'4" squat. And also the way I'm going to have someone who has longer legs than torso squat is going to be completely different than the way I have
Mm-hmm.
someone that's like equal on both sides. So when you're squatting, the main things like you want to be able to make sure that your glutes are firing. So for like a athletes, I barely have athletes squat below 90 degrees because I'm like, again, for athletic performance, when are you going to be in that position where your knees are past 90 degrees? If we're working on trying to strengthen the tendons, then having your knees go over your toes is it's the best thing to do because that's where you're actually stretching the quad and the patella tendon. But then if you are dealing with like PFPF, which is like knee pain, why would I have you do a squatting over your toes if it's really inflamed? Because I do not want to load the tendon then. I want to get your glutes working. I want to get your hamstrings working. And when the inflammation is down in the tendon, then we can start loading it with front squats or squatting and letting your knees go over your toes. So it's very individualized, and you have to know who you're working with and how and what you're trying to achieve with your squat.
And do you find there's so you talk about glutes firing, do you
Mhm.
find that athletes in general are pretty decent at activating their glutes, or do you find a lot of them still struggle with it, or is it more individual based, or is it more sports based?
It's a bit of both. It can be individual based and it can be sport based. I find a lot of athletes that are body aware, they know how to use their glutes. They know what it feels like when their glutes are firing and when their glutes are not firing. And sometimes it's just like patterns that you develop. You know, like if you are trying to think of an example, but if you're in a sport that involves like a lot of jumping, you're never gonna drop that into 90 degrees. So you're never going to put yourself in that position where your squats, your glutes have to fire, because your glutes fire when your hip gets into full extension, right? So if you're not in full extension, how often are you going to use your glutes that much, right?
Yeah.
So it definitely depends on the sports, depends on the individual, depends on like dominant side too. You know, like you're going to see, it's something that I do with assessments. You're going to find some athletes are very comfortable going one way because that's like that's the side you're supposed to be in the sport, and then you take them out of their position and your body just does not know
Hmm.
how to work. But in that case, you're like thinking of life post sports. And like, yes, you're really good at moving towards your right, but when you're not playing sports, you need to move towards your left. Then that's a case where you might find like one glute is not as strong as the other one. So then we start working on the other glute to make sure that, yes, in your athletic performance, you're able to do what you're supposed to do. But if I take you out of that world, you're still functional.
Is that how a lot of injuries end up happening? It's just like a lot of times the one side gets a lot stronger just because, maybe it's a position you play, right? Maybe you're playing right wing, so you end up turning from one side more often than the other, or whatever it is. So then,
Mm-hmm.
is that what something that causes most injuries you
Yes.
find? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the reasons for sure. So I know I've kind of spoken to both of you about this, but there's something called fascia lines
Hmm.
and myofascial lines, and those are different muscles and fascia around your body that work together to support you. So you've got lines that go from the left side of your body and your like lower body, and they end up in your right shoulder, and they go on both sides. So if I am always using just one side, I'm going to have one connection that's really, really strong and it's going to be stabilizing me. But then I get out of that, and then the other side doesn't know how to work. So then the side that I've been using to stabilize me just takes over. So and that's why you end up having like overuse injuries or lack of range of motion. And then when you have lack of range of motion, whether it's in your knees or in your hips, something else is going to try and make up for that lack of range of motion, and that's when injuries happen.